Good evening, friends, and shalom, man. Blessings to you all in the name of our Lord and Savior. Ooh, 1 second. Sorry about that. Sorry. Good evening, friends, and shalom, and blessings to you all in the name of our Lord and Savior, Jesus Christ. Welcome to this episode of, Unapologetics, the show where we are unapologetic about apologetics, and I am your host, CJ Cox. Want to go ahead and thank all of you who are currently here. Cryptomaria, Sandy C, and Jerome M have currently made themselves known in the live chat, so thank you all for being here. Definitely do appreciate it. Anybody else who is here and has not yet made themselves known in the live chat, I want to go ahead and give my appreciation to you guys as well. Definitely appreciate anybody who is here. If you are here, please remember to like and share this video. Please remember to subscribe if you have not done so. If you're new here, if you like this apologetics content, consider hitting that bell to get notified every time that we go live. And when you share this, make sure you share it to all the different social media platforms which you frequent. Of course, what good is a message without an audience to hear it? I want to also encourage you guys to please consider getting on alternative social media platforms like Minds, Parler, and Gab. Doing so will, of course, help us all in trying to weaken the big tech overlords and get rid of the censorship that they have put us all under. If you don't consider yourself to be politically conservative, that's perfectly fine. Obviously, it only remains a politically conservative echo chamber if you allow it to remain a politically conservative echo chamber. But if we all use it, then it just eventually becomes the website that we all use for our social media purposes. It just so happens that it includes free speech, whereas the other ones don't. So definitely consider getting an account with those guys. If you do, definitely consider following your boy and sharing this video to those different websites. And of course, thank you all again for being here today. Want to go ahead and go through some of the channel housekeeping real quick before we get too far into the video. So want to remind you guys first and foremost that we are going to have a Reformation Day special on October the 31st. October the 31st is not just Halloween, it is also the day that in 1517 Martin Luther nailed his 95 Theses to the church wall, or church door, excuse me. And so it is on that day that the Reformation has been celebrated by some, and we are going to have a Reformation Day special, trying to go as long as we possibly can. I want to get right out of church and into the special, and then hopefully we'll be stopping right before people go trick-or-treating and stuff like that as well. So it'll be a pretty long show. I'm hoping to get as many people on as possible. If you guys want to come talk the Reformation, religious liberty, Catholicism, Protestantism, and anything else that is related, please do consider first going to the thumbnail, which is currently up, and hitting the reminder so that you get notified when it goes up, but also actually watching the video, right? Because that's the whole point. Watch, definitely contribute if you'd like to. It is going to be an open mic, but definitely with a topic. And yeah, that is going to be a real fun time. Real quick, I'm going to answer a question here. Jerome M, my tag on all different social media will be the synagogue. My display name is usually different and varies from site to site, but my tag itself will always be the synagogue to keep things simple. The display name is Gabfly, which is a play on the website name Gab and the thing that what's his name? Aristotle. No, excuse me, not Aristotle. Socrates used to call himself, which was a gadfly with a D. But nonetheless, if you just look up the synagogue, you'll be able to find me. Also, Young Earth Creation, otherwise known as Raw Matt, otherwise known as Matt Man, otherwise known as the second SFT, if you will. SFT's right-hand man. Thank you for being here. I appreciate you very much. Cheryl is here. I appreciate you being here as well. Thank you. I think that's everybody else I got here. Appreciate you, by the way, Jerome. And yeah, back to the channel announcements we got. So also want to let you guys know at some point we will be doing hopefully either Monday or Tuesday. Tomorrow I actually work in the morning, which means I'll have most of the day available. And I'm hoping to do a response to Dr. David Falk, who did a response video to me. So that's going to be fun. Hopefully that'll open up some kind of a dialogue in some way. Talking about literalism in Exodus 32. Also want to have a series of these videos where I'm responding to big name, not necessarily religious YouTubers who are talking about religion. Doing that at least once a week. I don't know what day on the week it'll necessarily be, but at least once a week. This is obviously the last day of the week, so this was the last day I could for this particular week. Also am planning on having Dr. Kenny Rhodes as well as Chris Date on. Also, Ken Ami is a Messianic Jew who had a debate with Skylar Fiction, and he's been talking to me, so we might have him on here as well. And a few other things that we don't actually have the ability to announce for you guys, but that we're definitely planning here. So do consider hitting that subscribe button. Lastly, though, want to let you guys know that on December the 27th on the Gospel Truth YouTube channel, I will be debating Sentinel Apologetics Rob Rowe on the question of whether or not the Bible allows for death before the fall. Rob takes the position that it does, and I would take the position going to be a very fun conversation there. And if you haven't already, you should be subscribed to the Gospel Truth if you're interested in Christian apologetics and in debate of a religious, specifically Christian nature. That's absolutely phenomenal channel. Personally, it's my favorite religious debate channel. Modern day debate obviously is great, but modern day debate is more broad, right? Excuse me. Marlon and the Gospel Truth channel in general is more specific to Christianity and Christian debate. So that definitely is a different flavor there. Nonetheless, absolutely great. And that's all the stuff that we have as far as like announcements and stuff like that is concerned. So with that, we're going to go ahead and jump into a prayer, and then we'll get right into our video. Heavenly Father, I just want to thank you for the opportunity again, Lord, to study and to be able to look once again, Lord Jesus, at your truth, both in reality and in your scriptures, Lord. I pray that you use this video only for the glorification of you and your kingdom, Lord Jesus, and that you help us all to decrease, that you may increase, Lord, and help us all to actually hear you, Lord Jesus, and whatever it is that you may be speaking today, Lord. I ask these things in Jesus Christ's name, and we give you the glory. Amen. All right. One last time, I want to remind you guys, please do like and share this video. Get it out to the different social media platforms you frequent. And let's go ahead and get into this. So, topic for today is going to be another response video to a YouTuber who is not actually a member of, the debatosphere, as I like to call it. In other words, not an apologist of any kind, right? Not for the atheist side, not for the Christian side, just YouTubers who talk religion general, history, geography, all that kind of stuff, right? A lot of them have dipped their toes into biblical topics. And so I wanted to do a series of response videos once a week to these different videos, because I think these are obviously some of the more popular videos that end up going against our worldview. And I think that they are certainly worthy of a response. So today's, what would you call that? What we have in the crosshairs, I was going to say victim, but that's a little bit too rough, is Atlas Pro, who is actually also known as Real Life Lore, though that is a separate channel just run by the same person. And the channels that he does are, in the case of Atlas Pro, it's typically based on biogeography and geography, talking how continents got their names, why certain islands or areas of the world and all that other kind of stuff, have these different animals, the biogeography of like Asia and all that other kind of stuff, right? And so on and so forth. I'm being very general, of course, because he talks a lot about a lot of different stuff. And with Real Life Lore, it's a lot of times just kind of like fascinating questions, talking about like the area with the most population density in history, or talking about whether or not you could get a road all across the entire world, right? And a whole bunch of other stuff kind of like that. Very interesting kinds of things. And I actually greatly enjoy both of his channels. He did a video talking about the various flood legends all over the world. A very short video, only about 9-10 minutes. And also talking about some of the potential explanations for the various flood legends and why, basically explanations as to why there could be all of these similar flood legends in different areas of the world and different cultures at different times, right? And he went through a couple of different theories. He mentioned a couple of different flood legends. What I want to do today is basically, number one, add a little bit more context to his video, because obviously he was being pretty sweet in general, right? Which is short in general, short, sweet in general is what I meant to say, which is totally fine. But, so it's an only 9-minute video. We'll just get a little bit more context by reading more deeply into some of the myths as well as some of these different theories, right? And then also I want to present why I think some of the different theories that he gives are incorrect, and why I think a young Earth creationist view would be correct. Now, I want to be clear with everybody. I have a passing interest in science at best. So this is not some comprehensive scientific theory as to how a young Earth creationist flood could work. There are apologists for that. I am definitely not them, right? Rather, this is simply adding some historical and theoretical context to a video, which is enjoyable, but ultimately I think wrong, and presenting a soft case for why I think my theory, namely young Earth creationism, would be right. So without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and get my screen shared here. And I appreciate all you guys who are here as well. I'm going to continuously say that because, you know, got to continuously show appreciation, right? And we're going to go ahead and share a particular tab because I like doing that a lot better. All right. Jamie Russell is here in the house. Shalom, and thank you very much for being here. That's not what I wanted. There was somebody else I saw in here who I have not acknowledged yet, and I don't actually know who that was. But whoever you were, mystery person, thank you for being here. And I apologize for not acknowledging you. I also apologize for being a little bit of a loser when it comes to these tabs. But anyways, there we go. That's what I want. So this is a video. Is there any truth to flood myths? And again, it's by this guy, Atlas Pro. And you guys can kind of see here real quick. I want to point out why I'm doing these videos to these response videos to these more well-known YouTubers who are not quite as, apologetic in their nature, right? And as you can see here, 733,796 views, right? There was something like 660,000 views on the Did Moses Exist video that we responded to last week. These videos are the highly influential videos, right? As influential as Godless Engineer, Richard Dawkins, Lawrence Krauss, all these other people who are apologetic in nature are, the true influence comes from secular education and what they teach about the Bible and the world and about what they call, so-called flood myths and so on and so forth, right? I think we tend not to respond to them simply because we tend to think of them as not quite as biased or quite as apologetic in nature or quite as malicious as far as how they deal with our scriptures. And all of that may be fine and reasonable. But I think if we want to make a case to the greater population that, hey, there's actually a lot of truth found in our scriptures, you have to do it in response to more secular educators, not just to people who are specifically trying to make the point, hey, atheism is true or Christianity is false or what have you, right? Shalom to Kevin Blah, and thank you, Jesus. Thank you both for being here. Really quick, actually, I need to... there we go. All right. I'm going to go ahead and go on mute real quick, and we'll start this video, and we'll be jumping back and forth, of course. You guys enjoy.
Hey, so real quick, before I begin, I just wanted to say that I started a Patreon. If you'd like to help support me and this channel, there's a link in the description. Thanks. In Sumerian mythology, King Zusudra is warned that the gods are planning to destroy all of humanity using a great flood. The god Enki instructs him to build a ship, and in it Zusudra survives a 7-day flooding of the world. Afterwards, he is taken to the east to restart humanity. Many Mesopotamian cultures have similar stories, like the Akkadian Epic of Gilgamesh and the Babylonian Epic of Atrahasis.
All right, so right off the bat, he brings up a couple of different flood legends that we have in the Middle East, which of course is the same area as the Jews, right? And specifically, he gives us 3 different variations of the Mesopotamian flood legend, which the majority of modern day scholars would say is the original Noahic flood legend. Now, I, of course, don't share that opinion, right? I think that the Noah story is obviously an accurate rendition of what happened, right? Being a Christian. However, if you were to ask general academic circles, they would usually tell you that the Noahic story that we find in the Hebrew Bible in the book of Genesis is derivative of these Mesopotamian flood legends. And of course, that's where he is starting here. He gives us three in particular. Well, really, it's two in particular, but there is three. One from the Epic of Gilgamesh, which you guys probably know that one in a sense. Although you probably also don't, right? Nobody really ever reads the Epic of Gilgamesh. But a lot of people are aware that the Epic of Gilgamesh contains a Sumerian flood legend. Fun fact, the Epic of Gilgamesh, if my understanding is correct, is the oldest literary work that we have ever found, which of course is pretty awesome. He also mentions the Epic of Atrahasis, right, which is another account of the Mesopotamian flood. It's actually the most complete and full account of the Mesopotamian flood. And then the third one that I mentioned here, which is, it's not literally spoken this way, but the major source is the Sumerian Kings list. The way Livius puts it is the Eradogenesis, just kind of generally saying this is the Genesis story that they have, right? But the Sumerian Kings list presents us this idea of, hey, there were all these kings, and then there was a flood, and then there was all these kings after, right? Which is obviously a very general idea that we have there. Now, I want to give you guys a little bit more background to these stories because it is definitely true that they're incredibly similar to the stories we find in the Bible, which is why a lot of scholars would conclude today that they are actually the originals and that the Noahic story is derivative. I would postulate something different, namely that if this event actually took place, you would see the majority of humanity having some kind of cultural memory of it because it would impact all of humanity, right? And the Sumerians, being the earliest society that we have found, are just simply the earliest records of this event. But with that being said, let's definitely go over a couple of the stories here. I actually want to read the relevant portions for you of the Epic of Gilgamesh, as well as the Epic of Atrahasis. And of course, we do a full hour here, so you guys should, to an extent, expect that we're going and doing the deep dive, right? So let's stop the screen share here for a moment, and we're going to share another portion here. Let me go ahead and start my camera. Sorry, just a second. Oh, wow, and I was on mute. Anyways, my apologies. So, the first thing we're going to read here is not one of the epics itself, but is actually the Great Flood, Sumerian version, it says. Now, the website I'm on, just so you guys know, is livius.org. And it's an absolutely phenomenal website if you're interested in reading ancient sources from all over the world, Roman, Greek, Akkadian, Sumerian. Absolutely fantastic. They have a bunch of translations into English so that you can actually just, read these things for yourselves. And they have a whole bunch of different comparisons and charts and stuff like that that are really helpful as well. But enough, advertising for them, if you will. This article here is called the Sumerian version, and it details a little bit of the first portion here that he was talking about King Zusudra, excuse me, man. Still kind of resting a cough here, but that's all right. I am actually past the part where I'm feverish and sick, but leftover mucus and such. Not that you guys wanted to know that. Hey, you came into my podcast, right? But anyway, so to give the detail here, so the Eradogenesis is what this is called. What the article here is called, right? And again, it's on livius.org. The story of the Great Flood has its origins in Sumer, at least according to the article here. Now, they are talking specifically about the Great Flood as it pertains to Mesopotamia, so to an extent that is true. But obviously, we would understand as Bible believers that the Great Flood actually happened as a result of God, that Noah was the person who actually built the ark, so on and so forth, the Genesis story, as you've heard it. Has its origins in Sumer, the southern part of ancient Babylonia. Even though the younger Epic of Artahasis and the Epic of Gilgamesh, written in Babylonian, change many details, they continue to refer to Surupak as the city of the hero of the flood story. I'm sorry if I'm saying that wrong. Even though the Sumerian name of the hero, Zusudra, has been changed into Atrahasis or Napistum. Told you I'm going to pronounce some of these wrong. Napistum, however it is. In the youngest Babylonian version by Berusus, we see the original name return, testimony to the vitality of the Sumerian story, which had been called the Eradogenesis by modern scholars, or which has, been called the Eradogenesis by modern scholars. Excuse me. The story survives on a cuneiform tablet from the 17th century BC, which is obviously an incredibly long time ago. That is 1600 BC. To get that, put that in perspective for you guys, that is as far away from Jesus as we currently are from the fall of Rome. Actually, technically, it would be a little bit farther than that by a factor of, I think, about 50 years, because I think Rome fell in about 474 BC. So that is an insanely long period of time, 3,600 years ago, right? And a lot of the Sumerian and Mesopotamian documents and cuneiform tablets and stuff like that. I say documents, but they're not like documents as we understand them, like paper and stuff like that, right? They tend to be cuneiform tablets and stuff. Anyways, very, very, very old is the point, right? The story survives on a cuneiform tablet from the 17th century, of which only the lower third survives. However, this is sufficient to establish that the pattern described above was already present. I can talk, I promise. However, there are small differences. The Eradogenesis must have begun with the creation of man, but continues with the establishment of kingship and a list of cities. Then comes the list of antediluvian rulers, which confirms the pattern again, and the supreme god Enlil's decision to destroy mankind. The reason was recorded on a missing part of the text, but may have been the noise created by men, as it is in the latter Babylonian texts. Now, the interesting thing that you already see here that is similar to the biblical account, right, is it appears to be some kind of divine judgment. It appears to be a judgment that is on man in totality, right? Now, in this particular iteration, it's not because of their wickedness per se, as much as it is because they're just annoying, which is kind of a funny spin on it if you think about it. It could be that this particular story is different because that obviously comes from the later Babylonian stories, as we read. But you can see there is similarities, there is differences as well. And there's also a similarity in that there is a central hero who will be saved along with his family in the figure we have here as Artahasis or Zusudra. And of course, there's other similarities that he has to the figure we know as Noah, but we'll continue here. Zusudra is king of Surupak and a seer who witnesses the god's counsel and decision in a vision and understands that something terrible is about to happen. You see similarities to Noah in the sense that Noah was a prophet who received revelation from God. Now, again, you also see differences where Noah seems to receive direct revelation from God in the book of Genesis. It doesn't appear that he is actually receiving Artahasis. Artahasis is easier for me to remember than Zusudra for whatever reason. But nonetheless, is not actually receiving direct revelation as much as he is receiving kind of like visionary things, right? Which is obviously a little bit of a difference. He also doesn't receive the visitation of the god Jehovah, which is obviously a key and fundamental difference. After this, the god Enki, speaking from the other side of a wall, explains Zusudra what he already has understood. So in other words, he gets the visions. He then gets it explicitly laid out to him by the god Enki, but he already knows about this. And then we are going to see what Enki's going to suggest to him here in a moment, right? Enki's advice to build a big boat must have been mentioned in a large lacuna. The story continues with a description of the flood, which lasts 7 days and nights, which is obviously significantly different than the 150 that we see in Genesis. But obviously, the fact that he builds himself a giant boat to save himself and his family is obviously similar to the ark. After leaving the ark, Zusudra sacrifices and meets the sun god Utu, and that obviously bears similarity to the story of Noah in Genesis, where after he gets off, he actually sacrifices to Jehovah. And actually, that's part of the reason why when he's taking 2 by 2 of each animal, when he gets to the clean animals, which are not just animals that are clean to eat, but also clean for sacrifice, right? If you read through the whole law of Moses, he actually takes 7 pairs of each of those, right? A big portion of the reason for that is because he is sacrificing them on the altar when he gets off to Jehovah. Obviously, you have a similarity here in the fact that we have sacrifice coming from Artaxerxes, and then he is meeting with the sun god, whose name is Utu, which is kind of funny, right? You see the polytheism present here. Like Enki gives him the plan, and Utu is the one he seems to sacrifice to, and all this other kind of stuff. Whereas in the Bible, of course, it's always Jehovah, 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 right? So again, similarities, differences, so on and so forth. In a lacuna, the wrath of Enlil, who has discovered these survivors, must have been described. The end of the story is a speech by Enki and the apotheosis of Zusudra, who will live forever in the mythological country of Dilmun in the Far East, where Utu rises. The date of the poem's composition cannot be established, but it is reasonable to assume that the anonymous author was not the first to describe the Great Flood. He appears to have had older traditions. For example, Zusudra learns about the coming disaster through both divination and a revelation from Enki. One discovery would have been sufficient. The Eradogenesis is not the oldest text on the Great Flood, and it is likely that we will one day discover fragments of its sources. The British Museum alone takes care of about 100,000 unpublished cuneiform tablets. So you see the similarities of the story that he's referencing here in the story of Zusudra, otherwise known as Artaxerxes, otherwise referred to in this poem known as the Epic of Artaxerxes, and also referred to in the Epic of Gilgamesh, right? And we see the similarities and differences in the Genesis story. There's even more similarities and differences than that. So we're going to go ahead and now share a specific portion of the Epic of Gilgamesh, as well as a specific portion of the Epic of Artaxerxes, to give you guys a little bit more of a first-hand source here. And like I said, a big portion of this is adding context to what he already said, as well as eventually laying what I think is a case for what I believe, and of course, what a great deal of you guys would believe, as well. Excuse me. Real quick, let me check my phone here to acknowledge some people in the live chat. Who else do we have? Dell has shown up. Thank you for being here. Not Evolution has shown up. Thank you for being here. Shalom to Assembly of God. Thank you for being here. He asked, did Moses exist? Not the topic for today, but yes, I've done a debate on it and a video. Go ahead and check those out. And yeah, let's go ahead and get right into this. So the Epic of Gilgamesh, like I said, is the oldest work of literature that we actually have. So this here is not, of course, the entire Epic of Gilgamesh, but it is just a relevant portion that is describing the flood, and it is once again coming from Livius.org, which is a fantastic, absolutely fantastic source if you guys are interested in this kind of stuff. So this is Epic of Gilgamesh, Tablet 11, talking about the Great Flood. And we're going to go ahead and read this whole portion so that you guys get a little bit of a first-hand witness, to the stories that everybody talks about as being similar to the Bible, and that, of course, are being referenced in the video we're responding to, or reviewing, I should say. They're not really response videos, these videos I'm doing. They're more like reviews in a way, right, from an apologist perspective. Anyways, Gilgamesh spoke to Ut, and I'm again going to pronounce a bunch of these wrong, okay? Ut-Napistum, the far away. And I have been looking at you, but your appearance is not strange. You are like me. You yourself are not different. You are like me. My mind was resolved to fight with you, but instead my arm lies useless over you. Tell me, how is it that you stand in the assembly of the gods and have found life? Utnapistum spoke to Gilgamesh, saying, I will reveal to you, Gilgamesh, a thing that is hidden. A secret of the gods I will tell you. Surpak, a city that you surely know, situated on the banks of the Euphrates, that city was very old, and there were gods inside it. The hearts of the great gods moved them to inflict the flood. Their father Anu uttered the oath. Valiant Enlil was their advisor. Ninurta was their chamberlain, and Nugi was their minister of canals. The prince, was under oath with them, so he repeated their talk to the reed house. Reed house, wall, wall, O man of Surpak, son of Ubar Tutu. Tear down the house and build a boat. Abandon wealth and seek living beings. Spurn possession and keep alive living beings. Make the seed of all living beings go up into the boat which you are to build. Its dimensions must measure equal to each other. Its length must correspond to its width. So obviously there is a lot of similarity that you see here in the Epic of Gilgamesh already, and thus far, right? So we have him building a boat. Obviously, it's to preserve himself, but it's also to preserve all living beings, right? He's to seek out these other living beings so that he can preserve their seed upon the earth, right? This, once again, is divine judgment, although it is polytheistic in nature because the Sumerians are, of course, polytheistic in nature. There's some differences that we obviously see, that polytheism being one referenced. Obviously, the names are different. There is no reference in the Bible to the dimensions being cubical, which is what I would say. But in other words, each one being exact in length, as we just saw here, right? Same width, same height, all that other kind of stuff. Rather, in the Bible, we see a design that is much more, what would the word be? Practical, right? Pragmatic for actually having an ark and housing a bunch of animals and surviving a flood, right? But obviously, you see the similarities, you see the differences, and excuse me, I lost my train of thought there for a minute. You could see why people would be comparing this to the Genesis flood account. Excuse me. Roof it over like the Apsu. I understand and spoke to my lord E. My lord, thus is the command which you have uttered. I will heed I will heed and will do it. But what shall I answer the city, the populace, and the elders? He spoke, commanding me, his servant. You will then, this is what you must say to them. It appears that Enlil is rejecting me, so I cannot reside in your city, nor set foot on Enlil's earth. I will go down to the Apsu to live with my lord E, and upon you he will rain down abundance. A profusion of fowl, myriad of fishes, he will bring to you a harvest of wealth. In the morning he will let loaves of bread shower down, and in the evening a rain of wheat. Just as dawn began to glow, the people assembled around me. The carpenter carried his hatchet, the reed worker carried his flattening stone. It says here 2 lines destroyed. That is exactly what it sounds like. There are 2 lines of this poem that we don't actually have, right? Excuse me. The child carried the pitch. The weak brought whatever else was needed. On the 5th day, I had laid out her exterior. It was a field in area. Its walls were each 10 times 12 cubits in height. The sides of its tops were of equal length, 10 times 12 cubits each. Then I designed the interior structure as follows. I provided it with 6 decks, thus dividing it into 7 levels. The inside of it I divided into 9 compartments. Man, I cannot English today, and I cannot English most other days, but today it is particularly bad. Anyways, I drove plugs to keep out water in its middle part. I saw to the punting poles and laid in what was necessary. 3 times 3,600 units of raw bitumen I poured into the bitumen kiln. 3 times 3,600 units of pitch into it. There were 3 times 3,600 porters of cask who carried vegetable oil. Apart from the 3,600 units of oil for the dedication, the boatsmen stored away 2 times 3,600 units of oil. I butchered oxen for the carpenters, and day upon day I slaughtered sheep. I gave the workmen beer, ale, oil, and wine, as if it were river water, and they made a party like the New Year's festival. I set my hand to the finishing of the ship. The boat was finished by sunset. The launching was very difficult. They had to keep carrying a runaway of poles from the front to back until 2/3 of it had gone under water. Whatever I had loaded on it, whatever silver I had loaded on it, whatever gold I had loaded on it, all the living beings that I had loaded on it, I had all my kiln and kin go up into the boat, all the beasts and animals of the field, and the craftsmen I had go up. So you see, he's actually saving more than just his family, and he also has a great deal of treasure, right? And it appears that he's deceiving everybody else rather than preaching righteousness to them, right? Samos had set a stated time. In the morning, I will let loaves of bread shower down, and in the evening, a rain of wheat. Go inside the boat, seal the entry. That stated time had arrived. In the morning, he set loaves of bread, let loaves of bread shower down, and in the evening in the evening, a rain of wheat. I watched the appearance of the weather. The weather was frightful to behold. It's probably very unpleasant to read this when I'm messing up so much, isn't it? I went into the boat and sealed the entry. For the caulking of the boat, to Pazur Amuri, the boatman, I gave the palace together with its contents. Just as dawn began to glow, there arose from the horizon a black cloud. Adad rumbled inside of it. Before him went Shulat and Hanis, heralds going over mountain and land. Eragal pulled out the mooring poles. Forth went Ninurta and made the dikes overflow. The gods lifted up the torches, setting the land ablaze with their flares. Stunned shock over Adad's deeds overtook the heavens and turned to blackness all that had been light. He shattered the land like a raging bull, broken into pieces like a pot. All day long the south wind blew, blowing fast, and then flood came, overwhelming the people like an attack. No one could see his fellow. They could not recognize each other in the torrent. Even the gods were frightened by the flood and retreated, ascending to the heaven of Anu. The gods were cowering like dogs, crouching by the outer wall. I find that to be incredibly interesting, considering things like the sons of God went into the daughters of men and things like that. And I go back and forth as to whether or not I think those are actually angels or the sons of Seth, but nonetheless, it's just an interesting passage to note. Istar shrieked like a woman in childbirth. The sweet-voiced mistress of the gods wailed. The olden days have alas turned to clay because I said evil things in the assembly of the gods. How could I say evil things in the assembly of the gods, ordering a catastrophe to destroy my people? No sooner have I given birth to my dear people than they filled the sea like so many fish. The gods, those of the Anunnaki, were weeping with her. The gods humbly sat weeping, sobbing with grief, their lips burning, parched with thirst. 6 days and 7 nights came the wind and flood, the storm flattening the land. When the 7th day arrived, the storm was pounding. She who had been struggling with itself like a woman writhing in labor, the sea calmed, the whirlwind fell still, the flood stopped. I looked around all day long, quiet had set in, and all the human beings had turned to clay. The point kind of being that they're all dead, right? But nonetheless, it's obviously significantly different in certain ways from the Genesis story. The terrain was flat as a roof. That's interesting, considering the fact that there is a lot of theories that there may or may not have been as prominent mountains before the flood, but nonetheless. I opened a vent and daylight fell upon my cheek. I fell to my knees and sat weeping, tears streaming down my cheeks. I looked around for coastline in the expanse of the sea, and at 12 leagues there emerged a region of land. On Mount Nimus, the boat lodged firm. Mount Nimus held the boat, allowing no sway. One day and a second, Mount Nimus held the boat, allowing no sway. A third, a fourth, Mount Nimus held the boat, allowing no sway. A fifth, a sixth, Mount Nimus held the boat, allowing no sway. When a 7th day arrived, I sent forth a dove and released it. The dove went off, but came back to me. No perch was visible, so it circled back to me. So you see, this is obviously incredibly similar to the Noah story. He sends a dove and a raven, right, to look for land. I sent forth a swallow and released it. The swallow went off, but came back to me. No perch was visible, so it circled back to me. I sent forth a raven and released it. The raven went off and saw the waters slither back. It eats, it scratches, it bobs, but does not circle back to me. I sacrificed, I offered a libation to the 4 corners of the world. I burned incense in front of the rising mountain. 7 and 7 cult vessels I put in place. And into the bowls I poured the oil of reeds, cedar, and myrtle. The gods smelled the savor, and God smelled the sweet savor, and collected like flies over a sacrifice. Just then, the mistress of the gods arrived. She lifted up large fly-shaped beads which Anu, had made for their engagement. We're almost done here. Your gods, as surely as I shall not forget, your gods, as surely as I shall not forget this lapis lazuli around my neck, may I be mindful of these days and never forget them. The gods may come to the incense offering, but Enlil may not come in to the incense offering, because without considering, he brought about the flood and consigned my people to annihilation. Real quick, I want to note a couple of things that we see here, once again, that are similar, and a couple things that we see here that are different. We see similarities in that there is a sacrifice to the gods. In Genesis, it's a sacrifice to God, and the sweet savor of the sacrifice is smelled, and after this, humanity is actually looked upon fondly by the deity or deities in the case of the Sumerian legend in question, right? That is obviously similar. Differences we have, of course, are the polytheism. There seems to be a lot of disdain for the god who actually brought the flood waters on the hands of all the rest of the gods. We saw that all throughout, right? They were weeping and wailing, and how does this happen to our creation and all this other kind of stuff, right? Whereas in the Bible, it's a righteous judgment brought by the self-same God who does the blessing afterwards, because there is only one God, right? And these are, of course, very interesting things to point out. Obviously, we saw the dove and the raven as well. Again, with some differences. There's a swallow in this story, whereas there is no swallow in Genesis, and the dove doesn't ever end up coming back. None of them actually circle back around to him, whereas in the Noah story, we see the dove does come back initially and then leaves again, and the second time does not come back, right? So certainly a lot of things we see that are similar, certainly a lot of things that we see that are different, right? Just then Enlil arrived. He saw the boat and became furious. He was filled with rage at the Agigi gods. Where did a living being escape? No man was to survive the annihilation. Ninurta spoke to valiant Enlil, saying, who else but E would devise such a thing? It is E who knows every machination. E spoke to valiant Enlil, saying, it is yours, O valiant one, who is the sage of the gods. It's interesting that Enlil is considered to be the top of the gods here, the sage of the gods here, right? And he's also the one who brought the flood. Now, if you were a pagan society who maybe wanted to follow in some of the same footsteps as those who were before the flood, perhaps you wouldn't look at the God who brought the flood in a positive light. I'm not saying Enlil is the self-same as Jehovah, but maybe in this particular story, he does kind of fill the purpose of Jehovah in a sense, right? Or at least one of them. Or the role, I should say. Anyways. How could you bring about a flood without consideration? Charge the violation of the violator. Charge the offense to the offender. But be compassionate lest mankind be cut off. Be patient lest they be killed. Instead of your bringing on the flood, would that a lion had appeared to diminish the people. Instead of your bringing on the flood, would that a wolf had appeared to diminish the people. Instead of your bringing on the flood, would that a famine had occurred to slay the land. Instead of your bringing on the flood, would that pestilent era had appeared to ravage the land. It's interesting. A lot of people to this day still use this whole, well, why was it so harsh? So, all encompassing, so absolute, even the babies, even the elderly, even the cripple and so on and so forth. I say that with respect, right? God has all the judgment on them as well, right? You see this amongst progressive Christians, progressive Jews, non-Christians, and secularists, right? People are still to this day constantly asking why God's judgments are so all-encompassing, so absolute, and so harsh, right? And of course, we do a lot of responses to that, but the point just being that you see this even in the Epic of Gilgamesh, which again is the oldest work of literature that we actually have. It was not I who revealed the secret of the great gods. I only made a dream appear to Atrahasis, and thus he heard our secret. Now then, the deliberation should be about him. And Lil went up inside the boat. It's interesting that he actually blames the seer in this instance for getting a vision from him. That's kind of funny. Anyways, and Lil went up inside the boat and grasping my hand made me go up. He had my wife go up and kneel by my side. He touched our forehead and standing between us, he blessed us. Previously, Un-Apologetics was a human being, but now let Un-Apologetics and his wife become like us, the gods. Let Un-Apologetics, reside far away at the mouth of the rivers. They took us far away and settled us at the mouth of the rivers. Now then, who will convene the gods on your behalf, that you may find the life that you are seeking? Wait, you must not lie down for 6 days and 7 nights. Soon as Gilgamesh sat down with his head between his legs, sleep like a fog blew upon him. Un-Apologetics said to his wife, "Look there, the man, the youth, who wanted eternal life, sleep like a fog. Man, I cannot read. Blew over him." And I'm going to go ahead and drop this now in the live chat for you guys. So you can see the story, you can see the similarities, you can see why people would say the Genesis story is actually derived from this story, though we have also been able to point out a lot of the key differences. Some of the differences include, but are not limited to, the fact that it doesn't appear that any of these gods is all-powerful, the fact that Enlil, the god who brings the flood, is not the same as E, the god who reveals that the flood is coming to Artahasis, who is not the same as the gods collective who end up blessing Artahasis after he sacrifices, right? We see differences in the dimensions of the ark, so on and so forth, but we do obviously see a lot of these similarities. And as a creationist, of course, we would expect to see a lot of these similarities, because if the event actually occurred, and if it was an event that occurred to all of humanity collective, right, then it would be an event which the oldest societies in human history would certainly have some sort of recollection of, and would definitely incorporate into their myths, legends, and histories, right? So there's certainly no surprise there. I'm not going to read the entire Epic of Artahasis here, but I am going to drop it in the live chat because it is another one of the legends which he is referencing. And it obviously gives you a little bit more context even further as to what is being discussed here. Now, I'm going to preemptively talk about a couple of the other flood legends that he's going to talk about before we get back into the video. And again, I warned you guys we were going to be doing deep dives into this kind of stuff to present a lot more context into what is actually being discussed here, right? And I just dropped into the live chat the, I think, both the epics and the Sumerian flood things themselves, right? Nonetheless, so let's go ahead and share the next thing that we have here. We'll be pretty quick with it. No, that's not what I want. Sorry, guys. There's so many different tabs that I have up that it gets a little confusing. But nonetheless, while I am looking up this right now, please do like and share this video. Please consider subscribing if you have not done so. Hit that bell to get notified every time that we go live. And please consider getting this out to all the different social media platforms which you frequent. Of course, what good would be any message without some sort of an audience to hear it, as I like to frequently say. So we're going to talk about Manu now. And this is the Hindu flood legend, which he's going to reference in a moment. This is a very, very, very brief excerpt on it from mythandlegends.com, which is a reasonably trustworthy source. I say reasonably because it is an online forum and you need to take everything there with a grain of salt. But obviously, I am not going to give you guys the full-on college lecture on Manu. Not that I would even be qualified to do such a thing, right? But nonetheless, Manu obviously is a very interesting flood legend as well, and it has a lot of similarities to our own Noah story. In Hindu mythology, the gods created Manu, the first man, who gave life to all humans. According to legend, he was Earth's first king and the ancestor of all the kings of India. The most famous tale involving Manu tells of a great flood that destroys everything on Earth. So right off the bat, you do have a lot of differences. First off, their Adam character and their Noah character are the same character, right? In other words, their first man and their character in the flood are one and the same. He also has this role as the first king. He ends up being the creator, not of the cosmos or anything like that. So not the creator God, but specifically the creator of man, right? So obviously there is a lot of key and fundamental differences right off of the bat. And of course, he himself is a created being. So that is a pretty substantial thing to mention as well. One day, Manu was washing his hands in a bowl of water when he saw a tiny fish there. The fish pleaded with Manu to be placed in a larger vessel of water to survive. In return, the fish promised to save Manu from a great flood that was to come and carry away all living beings. Manu put the fish in a bigger bowl, but the fish grew so rapidly that he had to transfer it to an even larger tank. The fish continued to grow until Manu eventually threw it into the sea, and at that point, the fish told him that he should build a great ship to save himself from the coming flood. He also instructed Manu to take into the ship 2 of each animal on the earth, as well as seeds from every kind of plant. So you see here that there is similarities in that he seems to get revelation of this flood from a divine being. Similarities in that he is to build a boat, not only so that he survives, but also so that all the animals survive, and in this particular case, all the plants as well. And obviously some very important differences, right? The mention of the plants itself is a difference. The fact that this divine being is a fish is very different, and the sort of task that he has to achieve in order to get this revelation from the fish is definitely very different, right? It's also not a revelation in the same way that a revelation is in the Bible, right? As much as it is a divine being passing this information to you in a physical form, which is, it's obviously similar, but you can obviously see where the differences would come into play and how this would be influenced by Hindu mythology, right? When the flood came, Manu used a rope to tie his boat to a large horn growing out of the fish. Pulling the ship through the rough waters, the fish came to the Himalaya mountains. There it told Manu to tie the ship to one of the mountains and wait until the waters receded. After the flood, Manu became lonely because only he and the animals aboard the ship had survived. He offered a sacrifice and was rewarded with a wife with whom he began to repopulate the earth. Once again, you see there are some similarities here. He anchors in a mountain range, right? He ends up sacrificing to a god afterwards, right, in order to appease him or her or whichever god it happens to be, right? It doesn't go into detail here, and I'm sure if we actually had the specific source like we just read with the Epic of Gilgamesh, it would be better, right? But I couldn't actually find it. But nonetheless, and we see that he is to repopulate the earth. Obviously, there is significant differences as well. He's in the Himalayas, not in the mountains of Ararat. He does not actually have his family survive with him, which is very important, right? Noah obviously has his sons and his sons' wives and his own wife. And when he sacrifices, it is to get a wife rather than simply out of worship with God. You also may have noticed that in none of these stories have we seen so far any reference to the rainbow. The Noahic covenant and the rainbow being a sign of that covenant is unique to the Genesis story, at least to the best of my knowledge. And so that's obviously a pretty important difference for us to mention. In several Hindu texts, the fish appears as the god Brahma or Vishnu. The story of Manu and the flood also has parallels with biblical stories of Noah's Ark and Adam and Eve. And of course, that's obvious, right? That's why we're here talking about it today. Another story that we want to talk about, though it is significantly less similar, is the great flood of, I can't remember what exactly, I think it's Gunyu, but we're going to see it here on the screen in just a moment. But it's the Chinese flood legend. It's actually the one that's going to have the most significant differences, to be honest with you. And actually, I'm just going to share the whole screen for this portion because we'll still be moving back and forth. But nonetheless, very interesting story here. And we're just going to go quickly to the Wikipedia here because I've already burned through almost an hour just providing nothing more than context to what he said. We've only actually reviewed like 30 seconds of the video, right? The Great Flood of Gunyu was also known as the Gunyu myth, was a major flood event in ancient China that allegedly continued for at least 2 generations, which resulted in great population displacement among other disasters, such as storms and famine. People left their homes to live on the high hills and mounts or nests on the trees. According to mythological and historical sources, it is traditionally dated to the 3rd millennium BC, about 2300 to 2200 BC, during the reign of Emperor Yao. Archaeological evidence of an outburst flood on the Yellow River comparable to similar severe events in the world in the past 10,000 years has been dated to around 1900 BC. We'll get to that more in the future of this video. A few centuries later than the traditional beginning of the Ji dynasty, which came after emperors Shun and Yao. It is suggested to have been the basis of this myth. Treated either historically or mythologically, the story of the Great Flood has the heroic attempts of the various human characters to control it and to abate the disaster. excuse me, let me reread that. Treated either historically or mythologically, the story of the Great Flood and the heroic attempts of the various human characters to control it and to abate the disaster is a narrative fundamental to Chinese culture. Among other things, the Great Flood of China is key to understanding the history of the founding of both the Jia dynasty and the Zhao dynasty. It is also one of the main flood motifs in Chinese mythology, and it is a major source of allusion in classical Chinese poetry. There's actually multiple different flood legends in Chinese history. And to be honest with you, this one doesn't actually have too much similarities with the biblical account. We're going to go through the overview here. The main similarity that you end up wanting to take away, I guess, is the fact that they have this narrative that there was some flood that impacted all of humanity during humanity's early years, right? But a lot of the elements we do see in other stories, not just in the Mesopotamian region, but elsewhere, throughout the world, are definitely significantly different. And it could be that the Chinese legends are based on a completely separate event, mainly this event that took place in 1900 BC. But nonetheless, the story of the Great Flood plays a dramatic role in Chinese mythology, and its various versions present a number of examples of the flood myth motif around the world. Flood narratives in Chinese mythology share certain common features, despite being somewhat lacking in internal consistency, as well as incorporating various magical transformations and divine or semi-divine interventions like Nua. For example, the flood usually results from natural causes rather than from universal punishment for human sin, which is a significant difference from the vast majority of flood legends. Another distinct motif of the myth of the Great Flood of China is an emphasis on the heroic and praiseworthy efforts to mitigate the disaster, but most of which fail, by the way. Flooding is alleviated by constructed dikes and dams, such as the efforts of Gun, digging canals as devised by Yu the Great, widening or deepening existing channels, and teaching these skills to others. So, in other words, it's not something that is just naturally abating or that they wait in an arc to kind of like wait out, right? But it's actually abated by the Chinese people themselves and by this series of great emperors. And again, many of these different, reforms that they try to do to actually drain the waters, if you read the whole story, end up failing, right? But nonetheless, it is a flood legend that is very often referenced, and there's various versions of it that have different variations and different details. Another flood legend you have is Kapakli. Kapakli would be Mayan. Kapakli is actually a crocodile, right? And it's his son, if I'm remembering correctly. And we're just going to read quickly the Wikipedia here. That actually is the one who goes through the flood. But once again, you do see some certain similarities, some certain differences with the Noahic flood legend and these other flood legends around the world. Kapakli was the first day of the Aztec divinatory count. Excuse me. Of 13 times 20 days. I'm not going to try and pronounce this word. And Kapaktanai, or sign of Kapakli, was considered to have been the first diviner. In Aztec cosmology, the crocodile symbolized the earth floating in primeval waters. According to one Aztec tradition, Teocapactli, or divine crocodile, was the name of a survivor of the flood who rescued himself in a canoe and again peopled the earth, or populated, right? The Mixtec Vinaya Codex, or Codex, I don't know what this is, Vindobanesis Mexicanus, something like that, which is the codex that is the source for this Teocapactli myth, right? Crocodile is a day associated with dynastic beginnings. In Aztec mythology, Kapakli is a primeval sea monster, part crocodilian, part fish, and part toad or frog, with indefinite gender, always hungry. Every joint on his body was adorned with an extra mouth. The deity, and again, I'm not going to try and pronounce this because these names are just impossible, but one of these deities, right, sacrificed a foot when he used it as bait to draw the monster nearer. He and Quetzalcoatl, I actually know how to pronounce that one, created the earth from his body. So again, you do see significant differences here, but obviously similarities, specifically with this Teocapactli character who actually is surviving a flood on a big giant boat to get through. And obviously, there's the differences you have here, such as the fact that the flood is coming from a disembodied crocodile, the fact that there's this crocodile at all, so on and so forth. This is an article from Answers in Genesis that goes over the fact that there are different flood legends. There are hundreds of stories and legends about a worldwide flood. And it tries to explain why there is such a diverse history. We're going to go through this, right? But real quickly, one thing I want to mention is the fact that it mentions a couple of different historical stories, right? The Hawaiians have a flood that tells of a time when, long after the death of the first man, the world became a wicked, terrible place. Only one good man was left, and his name was Nuhu, which actually sounds very similar to Noah, right? He made a great canoe with a house on it and filled it with animals. In this story, the waters came up over all the earth and killed all the people. Only Nuhu and his family were saved. Another flood story is from China. This is a different one from the one that you guys just heard. It records that Fuhi and his wife, whose name was Nua, 3 sons and 3 daughters, escaped a great flood and were the only people alive on earth. After the great flood, they repopulated the world. Obviously, you have the 8. You have the fact that it's a family, 3 sons and their wives. You have the repopulation of the earth, though, once again, there is very significant differences in the Chinese stories. This next paragraph actually isn't relevant to what we're saying, but as you can see, there is other stories here that are not referenced. And the point is, you have these everywhere. And in fact, the last thing I'll go ahead and show you is this list of flood myths. There is so many different flood myths. It is absolutely insane. There's one in Egypt. The flood myth in Egyptian mythology involves the god Ra and daughter Sekhmet. Ra met Sekhmet to destroy part of humanity for their disrespect and unfaithfulness. So once again, you see that it's a great flood to destroy humanity for their wickedness. However, Re intervened by getting her drunk and causing her to pass out. This is commemorated in a wine drinking festival during the annual Nile flood. Literally got him so drunk that he couldn't actually move forward with the judgment. It's pretty hilarious, right? You see there's all these North American ones from the Choctaw, the Ojibwe, the Hopi, you have the Cree, the Eskimo peoples, which Eskimo is technically a catch-all term for the different Asiatic-looking peoples in northern North America. You see there's Mesoamerican flood legends, South American flood legends, Inca to be precise, Tupi to be precise. Even further, you go to the Near East, in China, in Iran, in India, in Korea, in Malaysia, so on and so forth. I believe there's something like 270 to 350 global flood legends. It's absolutely insane how many we have. One of the other really funny ones you have here is the Greek flood that I thought I had up, but I guess I don't. But the point is there is flood legend after flood legend after flood legend after flood legend. And that is the catalyst for the video that we're seeing here today, right? Why is there all of these legends? And why do they have so many similarities, right? Because it's not just that they're flood legends. It's also the fact that there seems to be so many similarities between the flood legends, right? Divine judgment seems to be a motif. Judgment of all humanity seems to be a motif. The repopulation of the earth by a surviving family in a great ark seems to be a motif. The surviving of animals as well in that ark is a motif. The person who survives getting divine revelation seems to be a motif. Sacrificing afterwards seems to be a motif. Landing in a great mountain range seems to be a motif, right? So on and so forth. It almost seems like all these different ancient cultures have similar, though obviously different, remembrances of a shared event in history, right? Which I believe is accurately described to us in the book of Genesis. But obviously, we've gotten barely into the video at all. We've just added a whole bunch of context into the video to show just how strong the case is and just why there would be a catalyst to make this kind of a video anyway, right? Why we would actually want to look at, the similarities we have here and find some kind of satisfactory explanation. Well, because these stories are very clearly based off of a similar or shared event, at least the majority of them. I do kind of suspect that the Chinese story, while it may have some vague recollection of this event, I think it definitely does have too many differences to be the exact same event. And considering we have evidence for this great 1900 BC flood, I think that might actually be the case. But who knows? Who knows? The point is, though, these stories not only have flood legends, but flood legends that sound incredibly similar to each other, despite being all across the world, despite being in different areas of the world as far as geography is concerned and all that kind of stuff, right? But also being in different eras of time, not having the same language, so on and so forth, right? But let's go ahead and go back to the video, which we barely even started. I might actually have at the beginning of this a little tag that says, hey, review doesn't actually start until like an hour in, but nonetheless, we just added a bunch of context here, right? Hope that was useful for you guys, but nonetheless.
Christian theology, it was Noah who was told by God that soon a flood would come and he needs to build a boat that can fit his family and 2 of every regular animal, and then 7 pairs of every animal meant for sacrifice. Yet people seem to forget that part a lot. At the end of this wrath, God allows the waters to fall, and
I do just want to point out that whole people seem to forget that part a lot. I don't know. It does seem to me like there's always some necessity for people to have just unnecessary digs at Christianity for no reason. I don't know anybody who forgets that. Maybe in like a painting that you saw at Sunday school, it might have been forgotten, so to speak. But nonetheless, it just annoyed me. Moving on. Not what I wanted. Hold up, not what I wanted. My apologies.
Where sin abounds, grace abounds more.
Is there evidence of a global flood? Because if something covered...
Hey, so real quick, before I begin, Noah who was told by God that soon a flood would come and he needs to build a boat that can fit his family and 2 of every regular animal, and then 7 pairs of every animal meant for sacrifice. Yet people seem to forget that part a lot. At the end of this wrath, God allows the waters to fall, and Noah lands at Mount Ararat in Turkey, and from him everyone on earth descended from. In Hindu mythology, reported in both the Sarapanta Brahmana.
Sorry, I just got to do a brief correction. It is not actually correct to say it was on Mount Ararat. The Bible says the mountains of Ararat, which is just generally the region of Armenia. More broadly, you could say the ancient kingdom of Urartu, which would be considered, if you look up a map of Greater Armenia, it's almost an analogous region. But also, if you look up a map of Urartu, you'll see exactly what it is. Northern Mesopotamia, around the Caucasus Mountains, that whole kind of region. It is believed by some that it is on Mount Ararat itself. Could be, could not be. I don't know. But just to be a little bit more technical and precise, the Bible does say the mountains of Ararat, and it's referring to the general region that we would consider Urartu or Greater Armenia.
And the Puranas. Vishnu comes to the first man on earth, Manu, in the form of a fish and warns him of Pralaya, a great flood to come. Afterwards, he gives Manu the advice to build a boat so that he is spared from the destruction to come. In Greek mythology, Zeus is angered when King Lycaon of Arcadia sacrifices a human to him. Zeus decides to end the Bronze Age by making the rivers run in torrents to raise the sea level. It was Prometheus, always impeding on Zeus's plans, who warned his son Deucalion to build a chest that would hold him and his wife to avoid death. One of the most important stories in Chinese tradition is the Great Flood of Gongyu. This time the flood...
So notice, and there's here one that we didn't even mention, right? We mentioned some that he doesn't mention, like other Chinese stories and the Hawaiian legend, right? But he mentioned one that I didn't talk about, which was the Greek legend, right? Which talks about how, once again, you have the judgment motif. You have the motif of being saved by a divine being who reveals the judgment. You have one person getting a big boat and saving himself and his family, right? So on and so forth. And you see this motif just plays out over and over and over and over and over again in India, Hawaii, China, Egypt, South America, Mesoamerica, Native America, Israel, so on and so forth, right? And they share so many different similarities that I just don't think you could possibly chalk this up to a coincidence or to them just having similar stories. Now, everybody's going to have flood legends of some kind because everybody's going to be around water, right? Or at least most people are going to be around water, right? River civilizations and coastal civilizations are the most common kinds of civilizations because water allows you to trade, water allows you to farm, water allows you to travel much faster than you would otherwise be able to before the advent of devices that utilize fossil fuels, such as automobiles and stuff like that, right? and all these other, different points that you could point out. But the point just being that you're going to have some level of flood legend that's going to be similar generally, but the details don't have to be as similar as they are here, and yet they always tend to be, right? The details of it being global judgment, the details of it being divine judgment and not just a regular flood, the details of how the people get their revelation and how they end up being saved and the sacrifices afterwards and so on and so forth, right? There's just too many different similarities to chalk off as a bunch of separate events, in my opinion.
Flood had no real godly causes, but the emperor was held responsible for preventing them. To do this, he first asked his relative Gun, who stole a magical, ever-expanding soil to build dams and dikes to prevent the water's arrival. This didn't work, so then Gun's son, Yu, was put in charge. I'm skipping over some stuff, but in the end, by digging drainage channels, Yu fixes the issue. To the Mayans, Sepactli was a crocodile or caiman who got his head cut off. From the blood of Sepactli, shells, jade, and bones flowed to create a new world. We haven't really decoded a lot of Mayan writing, so our understanding of the story is a bit vague, but what seems to be happening is, the world floods, and one man, in this case Sepactli, survives on a boat and repopulates the planet. All of these are examples of what's known as the flood myth, or the Great Deluge. Each one typically involves a deity like a god cursing the world with water and only allowing a small group of people and animals to survive and repopulate. The strange part is that nearly all cultures in some form or another have one, which is interesting because thousands of miles of mountains, deserts, and even oceans separate some of these civilizations, and many of these stories were told before there was exchange between civilizations.
So you see why I went into such detail in reading some of these and going over and giving a little bit more detail than he did with the story on the Sumerian flood legend and what's going on with some of these others and adding some more. And of course, not all of them that I go more into detail with, right? But the point just kind of being that you see the secular world acknowledges that this indeed is a problem, that for their particular understanding of history and geological history, right? And here he's presenting different explanations as to what could possibly explain away this problem, right? And I think it's incredibly interesting because this isn't actually the only time we see something like this occur. I believe it was Carl Sagan who famously wrote a book on why every single legend or every single culture seems to have legends of dragons, which was another very similar shared motif, right? And there's tons of other things that we have that are shared cross-culturally, despite the fact that there seems to be no link. The fact that this is found in so many different places across the world, and again, what he's even showing now is not even close to exhaustive, right? Only, in my opinion, indicates that there would have been some kind of event that all of these different cultures could trace their history back to that did, in fact, occur, right? Now, there are a couple different explanations for how that could be. I think the most obvious one would be that there actually was a great deluge sometime in the ancient past, and I think that is accurately recorded in the book of Genesis. Obviously, that is something that I think, it does include my own biases and stuff like that, but I think we'll get to why some of the other explanations don't actually work. But the point is, there is an incredibly strong case here, such a strong case that people in the secular world are actually wondering to themselves, hey, how is it that such and such a thing is actually possible, given what we understand about history?
With this being such a common theme across so many different cultures and over such a geographically diverse area, this raises the question, is there any truth to the flood myth? Well, let's get into it. So when researching this, I found there are basically two ideas that people try to use to explain this. One is through localized events, basically saying every civilization experienced a different serious flood at some time in their history, and it's just a coincidence that others have as well. The other side focuses on a single global event or circumstance which impacted everyone all at the same time, and caused cultures to develop similar stories as a result. I'm going to
Sorry, it is important to note he is not actually going to give the great deluge position any time in this video, which is the main reason that I would be responding to it in the first place. It's almost as if he just writes that off from the get-go and considers it not something that's possible, though he does consider the possibility of global shared events, just not necessarily a great deluge. And I'll get to why I think one of them, though it could be possible, I think it is still certainly wrong. And I think all of them are wrong, but it's the one that I give the most credence to personally. But he just kind of outright from the get-go writes off the possibility that there actually was a great deluge and that the ancients actually did know what they were talking about in regards to having this shared legend and motif.
Start by talking about some localized event theories, with the simplest explanation I've come across going first. So many early human settlements developed around rivers, and they would depend on seasonal flooding to deposit rich agricultural sediments. This dependency early man had on the flooding of rivers could be the basis of many flood myths, and explains why many of them are associated with the rebirth of mankind, as floodwaters would bring new life to a river valley each year. In Mesopotamia, for example, the Tigris and Euphrates rivers would flood every year, but around 2900 BCE, extreme flooding was recorded at several cities in the region. It's thought that this was caused by the moving of sand dunes blocking the Karun River, causing it to spill over into the Tigris River.
All right, so a couple things that we want to respond to there, right? So first things first, while it certainly makes sense, like I was saying earlier, that there would be shared flood motif to an extent because of the fact that there's going to be common population around water, whether that be in the form of rivers or coastlines or whatever it happens to be, lakes, whatever, right? That wouldn't explain everything, certainly couldn't explain everything, and it falls apart when you consider the fact that there are certain cultures that have these same legends that aren't actually built around these massive river systems. For example, a lot of the Native American tribes, though certainly not all of the Native American tribes, right? A lot of them are based around like the Mississippi, for example. But there are tribes which have flood legends that are in Arizona, for example, or deep in Mexico, right? Where there's little to no water, or where they happen to be on like these lakes that are they're inland lakes, right? So they don't actually have the same kind of what would you call that? They follow different. I'm not a scientist, so I can't really explain it great, right? But basically, the point is, I used to live by one of them. These lakes don't ever get to the ocean, right? And so they behave a little bit differently than other lakes would, whose rivers actually have an outlet into the ocean. I lived by Pyramid Lake and Lake Tahoe, which are both like this, right? They're connected by the Truckee River. But nonetheless, that's the point I'm trying to make, right? So there's societies that have these flood legends, like the Greeks, for example, like a lot of these Native American tribes, for example, the Mayans, people who live in the Aztec regions, right? Excuse me, who don't actually live by these regions, which you would expect to be impacted by these kinds of floods, right? And actually, the Israelites kind of fall into that category a little bit as well, unless they were just borrowing their legends from other people. If you look at Israel itself, Israel is on a coastline, right? But I don't think there's any serious evidence that floods from the Mediterranean have impacted Israel throughout its history. And there is no river to be flooding in Israel, right? You could say the Jordan River, I guess, but the Jordan River isn't really one to have these crazy floods, right? And of course, you can go on an exhaustive list. Australian Aborigines, for example, wouldn't meet the qualifications here, and so on and so forth. You can go on the list and explain all of it, but the point is just that, you know, you don't end up having a Occam's razor here, effectively, right? Where you're trying to say, hey, the simplest explanation works. Well, in this case, this particular simple explanation doesn't work because it doesn't account for all of the different legends for all of the different cultures, right? It also, of course, doesn't account for all of the details, right? The details of an ark, the details of preserving the animals, the details of the judgment on wicked man, the details of revelation to a certain person, the details of, like, for example, in some legends, you have the even details all the way down to having 8 people, right? And all these other kinds of things. Oh, hey, we have a Wesley Coleman, shalom. Kelby Quayo is here, shalom. Thank you for being here. I haven't acknowledged a couple people in the live chat, so I do apologize. But nonetheless, you see, in these particular instances, how these kinds of details, right, can't actually be explained by something like, oh, well, they've all been growing up around rivers. Okay, well, them all having rivers doesn't explain them having the same religious motifs around this event. Them all being around rivers, he claims it can explain the repopulation motif, but I don't actually think that works. To a certain extent, there is the rebirth after a flood narrative that you have that could derive just from rivers, right? And everybody knows this because of the fact that there is flooding in these regions, and then that's farmers tend to rely on that in the Nile region, in the Mesopotamian region, to grow their crop, right? Excuse me. But the reason I think that doesn't actually work is because I don't think it follows, therefore, that all the animals also have a rebirth as well. Considering the fact that floods do the exact opposite to animal life, right? And that would include humans in this particular instance, though I don't think that humans are animals, right? But just the point being sentient life of any kind. It destroys everything and very often can keep things underwater, even as seen by the numerous different regions we found underwater that are actually formerly cities that were above water, right? In other words, it doesn't appear to be a place where life is rebuilding after a flood, right? It's a place that is, after a limited amount of flooding, you get this rebirth narrative. In other words, I'm wording this terribly. I always do. Sorry. But in this maximal status, right, where you have a great flood, it actually does the exact opposite. It just completely destroys, right? And of course, there's other narratives that I don't think would be properly explained either, like the fact that there's an ark, the survival of all the different animals, all that other kind of stuff. The other thing that we would want to point out is he references this 2900 BC flood event, which may or may not have evidence behind it. And I'll go ahead and show you guys some of that here. Once again, I was saying we're going to provide some context, and I do plan on doing that today. So if we go over to this article from ncse.ngo, which stands for National Center for Science Education, which I know is not a source that is necessarily pro-creationist, right? But nonetheless, they talk about a Mesopotamian flood that occurred around 2900 BC, as well as another flood that would occur around 2200 BC, and a whole series of other floods, I think all the way going back before the 3000s BC. In other words, they talk about this evidence for a Mesopotamian flood, and they do specifically tie it into creationism, though, of course, they do it in a way that is contrary to our view, right? The assertion of some historians and archaeologists that a great flood devastated a region of Mesopotamia at the dawn of history and that this event was the origin of the biblical flood story has become a curious backwater in the debate over creationism. The topic is not proved of major concern to either the advocates of recent creationism or to their scientific opponents. It has, however, given considerable, if probably unwarranted, encouragement to day-age creationist scat theorists and those who hope to reconcile apparent contradictions between scripture and science, according to the article, of course. Within a few months of one another during the 1928 and 1929 excavation season, archaeologists at two southern Mesopotamian sites, Ur and Kish, announced the discovery of flood deposits, which they identified with the flood described in the Hebrew scriptures as cuneiform sources. The famous and glamorous Sir Charles Leonard Woolley, after his deep excavations of the early dynastic royal tombs at Ur, had a small test shaft sunk into the underlying soil. He persisted through some 8 feet of bare mud before finally coming to a layer bearing artifacts of late prehistoric date. It did not take Woolley long to arrive at an interpretation. Quote, by the time I had written up my notes, by the time I had written up my notes, was quite convinced of what it all meant. But I wanted to see whether others would come to the same conclusion. So I brought up 2 of my staff, and after pointing out the facts, asked for their explanation. They did not know what to say. My wife came along and looked and was asked for the same question, and she turned away, remarking casually, Well, of course, it's the flood. And of course, that I think is the proper interpretation, and it's an interpretation that is basically going to be completely ignored in this video. But nonetheless, we continue. Woolley's first test pit was very small. So during that and the next season, he had dug a number of other test shafts, including an enormous pit 75 feet by 65 and 64 feet deep. In this main pit, he encountered a deposit of clean, apparently water-laid soil up to 11 feet thick. Evidence of the flood was absent from several shafts and uncertain or disturbed in a number of others, but in many, Woolley felt he had certain evidence of the flood, and this came from 1955. Just slightly before Woolley's initial discovery, S. Langdon and L. Waitlin encountered smaller flood levels at Quiche, see Waitlin 1934. Although the Quiche discovery actually predated Woolley's find at Woolley published first, see Woolley 1929, and received the lion's share of the initial publicity. Woolley, moreover, produced a highly successful popularization of his work in which the flood finds were recounted in a manner that is at once simple, authoritative, and filled with references to familiar biblical materials, see Woolley 1929, 1954, and 1982. The finds from achieved and maintained a predominant place in the public mind. Initially, some assumed with great eagerness that the flood levels at and Quiche were identical and provided marvelous evidence for a historical kernel of the Genesis flood story, see Peak 1930. But the enthusiasm would not be maintained. The level of the Great Flood at was sandwiched between remains of the Al-Ubaid cultural phase, which the last purely prehistoric period of southern Mesopotamia, and a layer of debris from the early Proto-Literate period. The Great Flood, thus, can be dated with a high degree of certainty to about 3500 BC, according to this article, right? Quiche, however, produced evidence of two floods at the end of the early dynastic first and beginning of the early dynastic second periods, around 3000 to 2900 BC, and still more impressive flood dating to early dynastic 3 period around 2600 BC. And that's that flooding at early dynastic 2 that Atlas Pro is referencing. All three of the Quiche floods were much later than the Great Flood at Waitlin argued that the earliest of these three was the deluge of the Bible and cuneiform literature. Within a few years, excavations of a third Mesopotamian site, Shuruppak, which also just happens to be the one that we were seeing in the flood legends talked about earlier, also uncovered a flood stratum, see Schmidt 1931. It is of particular interest because, according to Mesopotamian legend, Shuruppak was the home of Zusudra, the Sumerian Noah. The Sumerian Zusudra means life of long days. The Akkadian equivalent, Uthnapishtim, is he found life, while the alternative Atrahasis means exceedingly wise. The flood levels separated late Proto-Literate and early Dynastic 1 remains and dates from 2950 to 2850 BCE. Perhaps, but not certainly, the Shuruppak flood may be equated with the earliest flood at Quiche. No other Mesopotamian sites have produced flood remains of significance. See Malawan 1964. And I'm not necessarily saying anything about the dates here, but this is this 2950 BC era is kind of what we're seeing referenced by Atlas Pro here, in that we have floods not only from the mentioned mythologically referenced Shuruppak, but also we have reference of floods at Quiche here. And he mentioned a couple other cities that he said had evidence of flooding around this era. I'm not familiar with any of that evidence, although I do know there is evidence of flooding in other time periods according to the secular chronology. Now, I, for one, would be questioning a lot of the dating. I do wonder if a lot of these events could be talking about the same event. And, it does seem to me that dating methods have been flawed throughout history. And so, that's obviously a conversation for a different time. However, I don't see there to be a huge amount of evidence for a 2900 deluge that is as grand as Atlas Pro actually is kind of laying out here, according to the secular chronologies, right? And so I would question whether or not that could actually be the basis for all of these flood legends, right? Especially considering, once again, it doesn't actually account for all of these similarities we see in the flood legends, such as the ark, such as the preservation of a certain seer and his family, such as the divine judgment aspect, such as the divine revelation aspect of being freed from this, and so on and so forth, right? The sacrifice that we see afterwards, and all these other things, right? Now, the article does continue to say a couple other things that I don't think are necessarily relevant, but I do want to go ahead and reference something here real quick before he actually gets to it, because it is another flood event that is being referenced when he talks about, hey, there's the different, local floods that could account for the fact that these all happen to be relatively similar, right? And this is an outburst flood at 1920 BC, which supports the historicity of China's Great Flood in the Jia Dynasty, and again, which I would say is probably a little bit, it does explain potentially why this story is so much different from the rest of them, as it could actually be referencing, if not both events, maybe this event entirely and not the original event that we're actually talking about, which all of humanity would experience, though I think it might be a combination of both. This is obviously very short, but just to give you guys some very, very general stuff here, right? And if you want to get full access, you'll have to pay for it. But nonetheless, abstract, China's historiographical traditions tell of the successful control of a great flood leading to the establishment of the Jia dynasty and the beginning of civilization. However, the historicity of the flood and Jia remain controversial. Here, we reconstruct an earthquake-induced landslide dam outburst flood on the Yellow River about 1920 BC that ranks as one of the largest freshwater floods of the Holocene and could account for the Great Flood. This would place the beginning of the Jia at 1900 BC, several centuries later than traditionally thought, which is why I think it might be a combination of both. This date coincides with the major transition from the Neolithic to Bronze Age in the Yellow River Valley and supports hypotheses that the primary state-level society of the Erlitu culture, is an archaeological manifestation of the Jia dynasty. And this, I think, is an incredibly interesting thing. I think part of the reason I think this is a combination of legends is because, first off, there is more than one Chinese flood story, right? So that makes it a little bit more likely that this is actually going to be a combination of different events that took place in their life, or in their cultural life, I should say, right? The other thing that makes me think this is a combination is their dating actually kind of coincides with a biblical literalist dating. They would have this flood taking place sometime around the 2200s, 2300s BC, which generally, give or take some years, is similar to what a biblical literalist would actually have listed. And that leads me to believe that they might be actually remembering two separate events. A big portion of the reason, though, why I think they're also potentially remembering this event, and would slightly agree with Atlas Pro in that sense, right, is because of the fact that there is so many differences in their flood legend from other flood legends that you see in India and Mesopotamia and the Bible, in Greece, and so on and so forth, right? When you see these other flood legends, they do tend to have a divine nature. This one tends not to. When you see these other flood legends, they tend to be preserved in an ark. This one, you don't see that. When you see these other flood legends, there tends to be preservation of animals and a sacrifice after. This doesn't actually have that happen. Obviously, an ark can't land in the mountains because there's no ark. And, there's a lot of other differences too. Obviously, the way that it's controlled, whereas in all these other flood legends, it's kind of just waited out, right? And that leads me to believe this could be the combination of more than one flood legend, right? But nonetheless, he is going to reference this as well. And the point just being, this explanation says, hey, there's all these different smaller events, events in 2900 BC in Mesopotamia, events in 1900 BC in China. The Minoan Eruption is referenced in this video, right? And these separate events, as well as some just general floods that happen around rivers and so on, could potentially explain why we have all these similar flood legends arising from all across the world. Again, I don't think that actually works because it doesn't account for all of the different flood legends. In fact, I don't even think it would really account for half of them, right? I've already pointed out the biblical flood legend is seen in a culture, the Israelite culture, that itself is not impacted by a flood, right? So unless you want to just conclude that they're stealing everybody else's, which I don't think you can, this doesn't account for them, right? There are cultures in, for example, the southwestern United States, Native American cultures, which have flood legends like the Hopi and the Navajo and so on. And they obviously are not around massive, constantly flooding rivers, right? And yet they have very similar flood legends. In Hawaii, you see similar things. I know you may say, well, isn't Hawaii on the coast and surrounded by all these islands and all that other kind of stuff? Yeah, but Hawaii obviously is not having massive floods overtake it, because if it were, it would be gone, right? Precisely for that same reason. The Greeks don't live by these regions. The Australian Aborigines don't live by these regions, and yet they all have this similar flood motif. Also, once again, it doesn't account for the similarities in these stories. Obviously, we pointed out a lot of the differences we have in the Chinese story, right? But if you go throughout these different cultures, there tends to be a motif of preservation on an ark, preservation of the animals, divine revelation to the person preserved, the divine judgment as the reason for the flood, right? Going and hanging out in a mountain afterwards, right? Resting there. The sacrifice that we have afterwards to the deities, right? And so on and so forth, right? So, there's just tons and tons and tons. And I see, by the way, shalom to Arctic Timberwolf in the live chat. Thank you for being here. Shalom to Mr. Phil Fox. Thank you for being here, brother. And he also points out many native tribes in the plain regions have flood stories as well. And while I know of their existence, I'm not actually as familiar with the details of those. So I appreciate you letting us know about that one as well. And I think some of them actually I'm a little bit more familiar with than others, in that I know their tribe specificity. Like I think I've heard the Ojibwe and Dakota, which are two different Great Plains tribes that are kind of up by the Dakotas in the modern day, have flood legends. But nonetheless, we see Sandy C points out NZ Maori have a flood legend. And again, right, and the Plains Indians and the Plains natives, excuse me. I am trying to get out of the habit of saying that, because that's not the most respectful term to use. But nonetheless, and the Maori peoples also are peoples who aren't around these rivers, right? So they don't actually, this explanation of localized flood events doesn't work for them. By the way, I see Archie Timberwolf. Did I already say shalom to you? I felt like there was somebody I missed. Rebuke and reprove. That's who it was. Jill. Shalom, and thank you for being here. Anyways, you see like why this localized legend theory just simply doesn't work, right? It also doesn't work in the sense that like all of these different legends do have one very important thing in common that we've actually neglected thus far, and that is that this is considered to be the thing that ended the last age, the great age, the golden age, and the new age, the age that we're actually still currently living in, right? According to this ancient recollection, and in many different cultures. And it's amazing that they all have this same understanding, considering the fact that they're so vastly different from each other in so many different ways, right? But anyways, this new age was started after this flood, right? For example, if you look at like the Athenian kings or the Roman kings as well, they are split into the antediluvian and the post-diluvian, right? If you see the kings on the Great Sumerian Kings list, same thing. It's split into the antediluvian kings list versus the post-diluvian kings list. Obviously, you have the Bible when you have this period of great lifespans and the patriarchs of the pre-flood days. And then after that, everything gets a lot worse, right? And so on and so forth, right? And that's kind of interesting in the sense that it's a shared motif, but it also throws a big monkey wrench into the whole question of localized flood theories, because a lot of these localized flood events actually take place at a point in time when the history is considered already to be established and they're already considered to be out of this golden age. For example, the Minoan Eruption took place sometime around 1500 BC. The Greeks would consider themselves to be already out of the legendary age at that point. And even historically, I think that would be considered the beginning of both the Minoan and Mycenaean period, if I remember correctly, which I totally could be remembering incorrectly. It's been a long time since I've done my very cursory overlook of ancient Greek history, right? But the point is, the localized flood theory, in my opinion, just simply doesn't work. But he's going to go talk about some other theories, so let's definitely go through the other points that we have here. And just a moment, let me go ahead and get back to the video. All right. Have you guys been hearing the audio this whole time? I hope you guys have. I don't know if I've been pressing the share tab audio the whole time, but I hope I have. Anyways.
The severity of this event is hard to determine, but if it was as bad as some records make it out to be, this flood could explain where the Sumerian, Akkadian, and biblical flood myths all originated. A similar mechanism has been proposed for the Yellow River in China around the year 1920 BCE, where a landslide blocked the river's flow. After a year, the blockage failed and released a year's worth of stored up water all at once. This might explain also why in their story the act of building dams to block the water wasn't enough, and the key was to drain the water out. But then there were people like the Greeks who didn't always live directly beside the banks of a river, and for everyone in the Mediterranean there's a different explanation. Around the year 1600 BCE, on the island of Thera in the Aegean Sea was a massive volcanic eruption causing much of the island to crumble into the sea. It went from looking like this to this. This was one of the largest volcanic events in recorded history, and the subsequent landslide created a massive tsunami throughout the Mediterranean region, causing wide-scale flooding throughout many human population centers. This event has been alluded to in texts as far away as ancient China, but it's debated how far inland the tsunami could have made it. Elsewhere in the world, around the year 2900 BCE, a meteor is said to have crashed into the Indian Ocean. Evidence for this can be found in the Burkle crater site off the east coast of Madagascar. The crater is roughly 30 kilometers in diameter and would have created a mega tsunami, which is the scientific term for a very, very, very big tsunami. This event could have affected nearly all coastal lands on the Indian Ocean, but even including all of these events, there are still many cultures across the world without a refined explanation. These inconsistencies have led many to speculate about a worldwide mechanism or a global event, which imprinted itself on the memories of nearly...
All right, so before he gets to that, let's talk about what he was just talking about, right? So he talks about the Minoan Eruption, right? Which we had already kind of referenced a little bit. And, of course, the Minoan Eruption is known by numerous other names. The Thera Eruption is one of its names. I think there's a Sarani or something like that. Saramani, I don't know. Santorini. And so lots of different names for this. The date of it is kind of not well known. It's sometime between roughly 1650 to 1550 BC. So 1600 obviously is kind of just a solid middle ground for that, right? But it is definitely an absolutely massive event. And as you can see by what he had shown you, right, it was something that completely blew the island to smithereens, so to speak, and is referenced all over the world in different ways. And some people have actually tried to use this to explain a whole bunch of different stories, including but not limited to the Exodus, Atlantis, and others. In fact, it's very common for popular historians today to try to weasel the Minoan eruption in some way into their theories of how such and such a myth could be based into history, right? And it's no different in this particular instance where we see, people trying to add it here. Now, as I already pointed out, there are a couple of problems with this. The biggest one being that the Greeks would consider themselves already to be out of that age at this point. And again, if I am understanding correctly, if I remember correctly, the Mycenaean age would already be considered started at that point in time. I believe it started sometime around the 19th century, if I'm not mistaken. So, out of the time of the golden age, so to speak. Not quite out of the legendary age, the heroic age, so to speak, but out of the age of myth in the Greek world, right? So it just doesn't add up as far as the timing is concerned. And I'm fairly certain the Minoan culture is actually destroyed by that one as well. In fact, some people have suggested that's why that could be where the legend of Atlantis comes from, right? And that could even totally be. I personally think Atlantis might be a variation of the global flood deluge myth, considering a lot of the similarities of like judgment and all that other kind of stuff. But a lot of people have suggested it could be talking about the Minoan civilization. And the Minoan civilization, to be fair, did end up surviving past this eruption. And I think actually ultimately is destroyed by the same thing that destroys the Mycenaeans, which is the Bronze Age collapse. But at any rate, it just doesn't end up working, I think, for those reasons, right? The Greek deluge is supposed to be happening earlier than this by, I think, a factor of 200 to 300 years. And, that I just think that's a big problem. Now, they could just say they got the dating wrong. That's kind of what they do with the Chinese legend. I'm a little bit more confident in what the ancients have laid down, personally. Although, even then, obviously it is to an extent, right? There is an extent to be said to all of this. The other thing he references is the Burkle abysmal impact crater, as the page which I have currently pulled up calls it. And I want to go ahead and share the screen here to very briefly read an abstract here for you guys to give you some context as to the details of that particular event. Because it's an interesting event. It is an event that we have some evidence for, and it is an event that may have something to do with the biblical deluge. It also may not. We'll end up, seeing what happens. It is interesting that it happened around the same time that this event that he claimed happened in Mesopotamia, which it does have at least some evidence behind it, right? Is said to have occurred. So, it could be that those coincide for a reason. It could be that that's just totally a coincidence. Again, I do question the dating methods. But nonetheless, it's a very interesting sort of thing. So we're going to go ahead and give some context here for it. Burkle Abysmal Impact Crater. Did this impact produce a global deluge? Okay. We have found an impact crater that is likely less than 6,000 years old. Burkle Crater is the central the Central Indian Ocean on the edge of a fracture zone at 38.87 degrees south, 61.36 degrees east. The crater is 29 plus, I don't actually know if I'm saying this correctly, plus 1 kilometer wide, and is the inferred source of layers with high magnetic susceptibility in 3 deep sea cores. Each layer goes to the top of the core. 2 out of 3 of the cores have basal Pleistocene ages, and the basal of the third is unknown. The high susceptibility layers contain broken plagioclase. I don't know if I'm saying that right. Sorry. Spinel periodite and chrysolite asbestos. One sample contains pure nitrogen with drops of oxidized nitrogen. Because pure nitrogen melts at 1,453 degrees Celsius, it is likely that the drops formed during an impact. That is a lot of degrees. The high susceptibility layers formed from 2 cores, are over 5 times thicker than they should be for a 29 kilometer wide source crater. We also find that a 29 kilometer wide source crater cannot vaporize enough seawater to produce meters of rain, even in a restricted region between 4,750 and 7,250, kilometers from the crater. Thus, we infer that Burkle Crater was produced at least, let me reread that. Sorry, dyslexia that I don't actually have. Thus, we infer that Burkle Crater was produced as part of a Shoemaker-Levy impact of a comet. The fragmented comet also produced 2 other large impact craters, one in the Northwest Pacific and one in the Central Eastern Pacific. Where the rain out from these impact centers overlaps, we see deluge events. that are over a week long. The impact also produced devastating tsunamis, winds, and associated social upheaval. We see the event around 2807 BC. And it's possible that this could have something to do with the global deluge story, especially considering the fact that it actually seems to have a greater impact than Atlas Pro actually lets on, right? And that it also had some impact in the Pacific Ocean as well, elsewhere in the Pacific Ocean, right outside of the Indian Ocean. And it is possible that it could coincide with something that did happen around the Mesopotamian region. It is possible that this could be something that caused a global deluge, or at least contributed to a global deluge. Who knows, right? I don't think that it by itself does account for the global deluge for a couple of reasons. The main reason being that, once again, it doesn't account for the similarities and the details of the story, which is really one of the big things that I think impacts our understanding of, hey, is it possible that Noah could be giving us an accurate representation of this historically, right? It also, I think, doesn't actually end up impacting all of the necessary areas. Doesn't it, for example, seem to account for the Greeks? Doesn't seem to account for people like the Koreans, the different Native American tribes we've referenced, so on and so forth. Australian Aborigines could potentially be impacted by this, but also could potentially not. The point just being that there is too many other cultures that would not be impacted by even this event, coupled with a Mesopotamian event, coupled with an understanding that the Chinese event is about something else. You could grant all those things. You could even continue to grant that the Greek event could be about the Minoan civilization, and still there are civilizations, which have a account which shares a lot of the same details and which are not accounted for. And I think that that's important, because effectively what it shows us is that localized flood theories don't work. And with that, let's go ahead and jump back to the video here. All right. Please remember, friends, if you are liking this, to like and share this video. Please consider subscribing if you have not done so. Please hit that bell to get notified every time we go live. And let's get back into this.
Nearly all cultures at the same time. Of course, a lot of these speculations aren't fully backed up by science, but there are 3 ideas I think are plausible. And again, I'll start with what I believe to be the most simple of these explanations. So, because of the movement of plate tectonics, land that was previously under the sea can be pushed above the water and even form mountains. This can lead to ancient rocks containing fossils and shells to make it up to high elevations. When ancient people found these shells and fossilized sea creatures atop mountains, many believed this to be evidence that the entire world had, at some point in the past, been completely submerged in water. Since many places that are today above water were once submerged, this phenomena could have been observed across the planet. And if it wasn't the reason the flood myth began, it definitely served as evidence for many early people to prove that it happened. Another theory...
Excuse me. So, I hope you guys didn't get an echo on that, because I did actually forget to mute my microphone here. At any rate, though, so excuse me, we see here his reference to the fact that seashells were found all over the world, and the fact that ancients were able to document that these were sea creatures could have certainly either been the source, or at least evidence for, excuse me, the global deluge idea, right? And certainly we do know that the ancients used this as evidence that there was a global deluge. To give you a couple of examples, one of the most famous examples is Xenophanes, and a main reason for that is because he's the earliest recorded instance of anybody actually doing what we would today consider paleontological work, right? And Xenophanes was an ancient Greek philosopher, right? And he actually speaks of this idea of, excuse me, kind of like cyclical destruction, which is something that you actually see repeated in works of Aristotle and in works of Plato, as well as a couple of others. And he has this conclusion that one of these different destructions actually coincides with the great deluge of his own Greek myth, right? Excuse me. So let me go ahead and get a quote here, because there is something I wanted to quote here for you. So Xenophanes appears to have explored many of the same phenomena studied at an earlier date by the Milesians. B28 presents a view of the nature and extent of the Earth's depths. B30 identifies the sea of the source of clouds, wind, and rain. B32 comments on the nature of iris, rainbow. And B37 notes the presence of water in caves. I'm going to give you guys the source in this so you can actually read it all for yourself, but it's actually Stanford Dictionary of Philosophy. B39 and B40 mention cherry trees and frogs. A38 through 45 discuss various astronomical phenomenon, and A48 indicates an interest in periodic volcanic eruptions in Sicily. Hippolytus credits Xenophanes with a theory of alternating periods of worldwide flood and drought that was inspired at least in part by the discovery of fossilized remains of sea creatures in inland locations. Whether or not Xenophanes himself traveled to Syracuse, Paros, and Malta, where these remains were found, his use of the information as the basis for a broad explanation of phenomenon is an implicit testimonial to the heuristic value of information gained through travel and observation. And this accreditation that we see from Hippolytus to Xenophanes is actually considered to be the earliest record we have of paleontological work. And as you can see, it is something that was used to conclude that indeed there was a global flood. Now, of course, this can't be the source for that, because Xenophanes is speaking well after the Greek flood myth has been established, as well after a lot of these other flood myths has been established as well, right? I just said it as well more than I had to. It's redundant. But anyways, the point just kind of being that these different legends are much, much, much older than any record we have of anybody doing paleontological work, even if we assume that somebody did it a whole 1,500 years before Xenophanes did, which was in the 400s BC. That would only bring us back to the 1900s BC. And while even according to the traditional understanding, that would be older than the Book of Genesis, it certainly wouldn't be older than when the Book of Genesis places Noah. And it also certainly wouldn't be older than our oldest work of literature, namely the Epic of Gilgamesh. It also wouldn't be older than our oldest Sumerian kings lists, which also tell of a great global deluge. The point just kind of being that this idea doesn't account for the flood at all. It's just certainly falls apart. If anything, it actually provides evidence for a global deluge, and for the idea that a actual great deluge that wiped out all of humanity did take place, right? We see this repeated, by the way, by, like I said, the great philosophers Aristotle and Plato. To quote from Anton Hermann Corset in his book Great Deluge in Aristotle on Philosophy, at least I think that's what the book is called. This might just be the chapter, but nonetheless, he first refers to Plato. In Timaeus 22a, Plato refers to the Great Deluge and to the survival of Deucalion and Pariah, which obviously means that those myths already exist, right? In Critias 109d, he mentions the destruction of those who had received the tradition when the gods divided the earth amongst themselves, and Attica was allotted to Hephaestus and Athena. In Critias 112a, he relates that in one night, in torrential rains, Attica was inundated, and that the flooding was the third before that of Deucalion in Critias Deucalion, and then it says in Critias 11b, he insists that many great deluges had taken place in the remote past. And so you do see that this idea is adopted from Xenophanes, and again, this is repeated later on by Aristotle, of an idea of cyclic deluges, and one of them happening to coincide with Deucalion's deluge, or what they would call the Great Deluge, right? Because it would be the one that impacted the society and that was told of in myth and legend. Here in the same chapter, Aristotle likewise is concerned with the theories of cyclic catastrophes. In Meteorologica 352a28ff, he links the cyclic floods, which destroy part of mankind, or to be more exact, part of human civilization, to the periodic great year. According to Aristotle, quote, we must suppose that the cause of all these changes is that a fixed intervals at fixed intervals, in some great period of time, there is a great winter and a great excess of rainfall. But this does not always happen in the same region of the earth. But if the rivers come into being and perish, the same parts of the earth are not always moist. The sea, too, must necessarily change correspondingly. And this is, by the way, where you start to see the first turning away from the idea that it's global, right? Xenophanes and Plato talked about cyclical floods that would destroy civilization, right? And Aristotle is the first who starts to say cyclical, localized floods. Interestingly enough, this does actually continue on through other people who notice a lot of the same things. For example, we see the Chinese philosopher Shen Kuo, who, much like Aristotle, Xenophanes, and Plato, is a genius, but much like them, I think is going to be wrong on this, of course. We see here, and this is from his Wikipedia, it was Shen Kuo who formulated a hypothesis about the process of land formation or geomorphology based upon several observations as evidence. This included his observation of fossil shells in a geological stratum of mountain hundreds of miles from the ocean. He inferred that the land was reshaped and formed by erosion of the mountains, uplift, and the deposition of silt after observing strange natural erosions at the Taihang Mountains and the Yangdang Mountains in Wenzhou. He hypothesized that inundation of silt, the land of the continent, that with the inundation of silt, the land of the continent must have been formed over an enormous span of time. And he ends up being kind of the first who ends up saying, hey, these shells must kind of be not just localized flood events, but spread out over an incredibly long period of time. And then we see this also come to a halt with Leonardo da Vinci, who says the following: during the Renaissance, there are several hypotheses of why shells and fossilized forms of living creatures were found in rocks on tops of mountains. Some believe the shells have been carried there by the biblical flood, which of course is my position, while others thought that these shells had grown in the rocks. Leonardo disliked both of these explanations and refuted them based upon his careful observations, or at least to his own satisfaction. Leonardo doubted the existence of a worldwide flood, noting that there would have been no place for the water to go when the flood waters receded. His observations recorded that rain falling on mountains rushed downhill, not uphill, and this suggested that any great flood would have carried fossils away from the land and not towards it. It's funny because a lot of you guys here who debate young Earth creationism, you probably heard these arguments. You may not know that they have their source back in one of the great geniuses of our time, Leonardo da Vinci. Now, of course, I'm not obviously just because he was a genius doesn't mean anything, right? He was wrong in this instance, I think. But I just giving you guys the full context of what happened here. As for the second hypothesis of his time, he disputed it by noting the evidence that these shells had once been living organisms and therefore could not have grown without access to food, which as shells, they would not have if anchored in the rocks, which of course he's right in that regard. And what's the point you see here, right? The point is you see that at first, men like Xenophanes and even Plato are using this as evidence that, hey, there's a great deluge. Then eventually over time, you're seeing this morph over to, hey, there were many deluges that are localized. And then eventually by the time you get to 1000 AD, you finally see Shen Kuo saying, no, this is taking place over vast periods of time. And you see it demonstrated in the West by Da Vinci in the 1500s BC, right? So what's the point? The point is, the farther back you go, the closer to the event you go, the closer you see this. There was this understanding that this was evidence of a global deluge, not something that was the source of a global deluge. And it was only later on that people started to suggest, hey, this wasn't actually explained by some kind of a global deluge. Now, as people at Answers in Genesis and other creationist places have pointed out, this could only be evidence of a great deluge because fossils, by their very nature, seem to require being laid down by water in sediments all over the earth, as Ken Ham has famously said. So while I certainly respect a lot of the stuff that Aristotle, that Shen Kuo, that Leonardo da Vinci ended up saying, I do have to agree with the earlier Plato and Xenophanes and other ancients like them who concluded that this was actually evidence of a great deluge, as they found in their own myths and legends. But nonetheless, you can see why that doesn't end up working for a idea for this, right? Because it was always seen as something that needed to be explained, not something that was actually the source of legends, right? And the legends happen to be an explanation for them that already existed that people relied upon, right? And of course, is only in the future, much later in the future, that they end up actually saying, no, this is actually something that is not evidence of a global flood, and so on and so forth, right? Hope that all made sense. I'm definitely getting, way deep into this stuff, but I'm trying to give you guys the full context of everything that's being said in this video, right? As we review it. Wesley Coleman, I am a global flood believer. I am just pointing out that the fossils were seen as evidence as a global flood that was backed up in mythology, and that it was only later on that people actually started to suggest that it would not be evidence of a global flood later in like the 1000s and 1500s AD. Well, really the first one being Aristotle, right, which would be about the 300s BC. But nonetheless, back to the video.
Places the Great Deluge as far back as 6400 BCE. The last glacial period was coming to a close, and the glaciers covering North America were melting. Except, instead of draining out, a lot of the water drained into a massive lake in the middle of the glacier. This lake, called the Lake Agassiz, was possibly the largest lake Earth has ever seen, covering up to 4,400 square kilometers, which is way bigger than the Caspian Sea, the largest lake on Earth today. As the Ice Age came to a close, a section of the glacier broke off and released nearly all of this water at once into the ocean. It's hard to say how much water was released because the glaciers that contained it have since melted, but it's thought that this would have caused massive flooding along the coasts worldwide. This event could have also altered ocean salinity and circulation, which in turn could have created strange weather events that people at the time could not explain. The third theory I want to talk about also
All right, so in this particular event, he says it could be explained by the flooding this lake caused. And again, we're going to need to share screen here to give you guys some context there. We are almost done. I know we're hitting on 2 hours, but we are almost done. I wanted to go full on deep dive into this, right? Explain why all the different things here I don't think should actually be counted as good explanations, and why, in their on the flip side, I think a global deluge would be. And I hope I've been doing that so far, right? But nonetheless, we are almost done here. So, sorry here. We're going to go to this article here. Lake Agassiz and the 8200 BP cold event, or Agassiz, however you say that. This is the event that he is speaking of. During the last deglaciation of North America, huge proglacial lakes formed along the southern margin of the Laurentide ice sheet. The largest of these was Glacial Lake Agassiz, which formed around 11.7 CKYR. I don't really know what that means. And drains into the Hudson Bay about 7.7 CKYR. Overflow from these lakes were variably directed to the Mississippi, St. Lawrence, and Mackenzie drainage systems, and it is thought that switches and routings were accompanied by a response in ocean circulation that preceded abrupt climate events. When the ice dam across Hudson Bay finally was breached, a massive flood drained Lake Agassiz, which was routed through Hudson Strait to the Labrador Sea. In terms of stored water volume, the largest reservoir was associated with the, I'm going to pronounce this terribly, sorry, Kinoyevis level of Lake Agassiz. For the maximum filling, the impounded water volume available to produce floods is estimated as 40,000 to 151,000 kilometers cubed, depending on the location of the ice margin and route used. The timing of this rapid release of stored fresh water just precedes the early Holocene cooling event of 82 Cal KYRBP. Again, I don't know what that means, but maybe you guys do. We use the Spring-Hutter theory to simulate flood hydrographs for floods that originate in subglacial drainage conduits and find that flood magnitude and duration are 58 V, again, I don't know what that means. I'm sorry. I probably even should have, learned what this meant before I read it. And 0.5 YR, multiple fillings and floods are possible, as are single floods having a complex multi-pulse structure. Modeling results suggest that the outburst flood from Lake Agassiz may have terminated before the lake surface elevation dropped to sea level, and that the flood ended when a stable drainage channel was established, connecting Lake Agassiz to the Tyrrell Sea. So that's the whole thing that he's talking about here, right? Now, why do I think that this event also would not be able to explain the different events here, right? Well, again, it doesn't actually account for the similarities that we have here. And again, we'll list them as if we haven't listed them ad infinitum already, right? But the ark, the preservation of a single person, the judgment, the destruction on all humanity, the relation of this person, the sacrifice afterwards, the preservation of animals, so on and so forth, right? The other thing here is I don't know how established it is in these secular communities that this actually would cause a whole bunch of crazy climate change and massive deluge everywhere else. I do know there is a commonly accepted event at the end of the Pleistocene, beginning of the Holocene, that would see a whole bunch of regions flooded. And I even do think there could be some linkage of that potentially to a global deluge, though I think it's greater in scope than what they would suggest. But I don't know how I don't know how confident they are that this plays a big impact. And if they're not even confident in it, I don't know why we would be confident in it in regards to, this actually explaining these different flood legends, especially when we have something that Occam raises it so much easier, which is that actually at a time when humanity was, linked all together with each other in such a way that they could all experience the same event, there was a great deluge that indeed wiped out all of humanity, or what we would call the global flood of Noah. Last theory he's going to go on, and then we are almost done here, friends.
Deals with the ending of the last ice age, but is far less catastrophic. So around 12,000 years ago, the icy Pleistocene epoch was coming to a close as temperatures around the world increased slightly, beginning the epoch we're currently living in, the Holocene. This increased temperature caused the retreat of glaciers that had extended far beyond the poles. As these meltwaters entered rivers, lakes, and eventually the oceans, the planet's sea level rose by up to 125 meters. If we look at a map of the world before this happened, we can see large areas of land exposed that aren't today. Some places to note would be the Persian Gulf, which was a hub of early human activity and was completely dry and presumably inhabited at this time. Large portions of India's coastline were also above sea level at this time, and huge parts of southeastern Asia was habitable as well. In the Mediterranean, the Tyrrhenian Sea beside Italy was completely dry, and a lot of the Black Sea was likely populated too. In northern Europe, this massive plain called Doggerland was opened up and definitely contained large populations, as people have found tools underneath the waters that now cover this land. Lastly, in the Americas, much of the northeast coast was extended further into the Atlantic, and peninsulas like Florida and the Yucatan were greatly expanded as well. People would have been living in all of these places until glacial meltwaters pushed them out. This forced migration would have brought refugees to higher elevations inland, who would have likely told other people about their experiences. But this all happened fairly slowly, except for a few spikes in temperature along the way, and it also happened thousands of years prior to the formation of flood myths mentioned at the beginning. Whether
So he kind of already explained what my problems with this one are, right? It's gradual, it's non-catastrophic, and in the end, it doesn't actually line up with the timeline that we have presented for us. And that's, of course, according to their particular timeline. Now, I do think that this event did occur, namely the flooding of these regions. And I think it does have something to do with our Great Deluge. I tend to believe that the Ice Age was a very short event. The Ice Age and the Stone Age were very short coinciding events that happened right after the flood. And that at the end of these events, this would have taken place. And probably a lot more rapidly than people think, though not very rapidly, maybe over the course of like 100 to 200 years. Though I'm not exactly sure how that works out, because there is biblical evidence that the Great Deluge could actually be as far back as about 3000 BC rather than 2300 BC, which I think actually would make a little bit more sense. But that is what we get in the Septuagint, as well as a few others like the Samaritan Pentateuch, believe it or not. But nonetheless, it doesn't appear to work for those reasons, right? Non-catastrophic, way too far beforehand, according to their own timeline, and doesn't appear to be something that, well, that would have a bunch of legends written about it, basically. It also, once again, does not account for all of the different similarities. The ark, the preservation of the animals, the yada, the yada, the yada, the so on, right? What does account for all of those things? There is one theory completely neglected in this video that I think accounts for all those different things, right? And accounts for the question that Atlas Pro is asking, which is, why do all these cultures have these self-same legends that are so similar to each other, right? The answer is because there was actually a great deluge at a point in time that impacted all of humanity, and that it was actually the judgment of God on wicked man. He revealed himself to his prophet Noah, and that is recorded for us in the scriptures in the book of Genesis, which was written originally by Moses, right? Now, obviously, that's very much loaded with the apologetics nature of this channel. But ladies and gentlemen, if it's truth, then it's truth. And I think it is truth, personally. I think it explains the question that is being asked here. I think it explains a lot of the evidence that we see, even, such as the things as fossils that we see everywhere, such as the fact that there does appear to be evidence of these floods in all these different areas, such as the fact that it does appear that at some point in time, there was an ice age, and there was a time when the water levels were a lot lower, and all this other kind of stuff, right? And I'm not 100% opposed to something like a catastrophic version of the third, which would be the old Earth creationist idea. I am a young Earth creationist, but I do believe that that idea would suffice the Bible, even though I don't think the Bible actually teaches that idea. I don't know. And I say that trepidatiously, in the sense that I mean that those people are Christians, and that idea isn't ludicrous to me. You know what I mean? But nonetheless, I think that that is the ultimately neglected portion of this. And I think it answers Atlas Pro's question. Why is there all these myths of a global deluge? Why does there appear to be evidence of a global deluge? How can we explain it? Well, because, ladies and gentlemen, just as all the myths teach us, and just as more clearly the scriptures teach us, there was indeed a great deluge, and it impacted all of primitive man. And I think that there's just indisputable evidence of that. With that being said, that's basically the end we have here. Let's go ahead and let the video finish out, and then we're going to go ahead and wrap up this video.
Our culture could remember an experience like this for so long is still up for debate, but I still hope you enjoy learning about some of the possible explanations, and please let me know which ones, if any, you think could have inspired these stories. If you liked this video and would like to see more like it, why not subscribe and give this video a like? I have another video coming out next week, so make sure to check back then. Thanks.
All right, as it turned out, that wasn't even necessary. So, that is all my thoughts, friends. That is my review of this video. Why is there all these different global legends? Why do they have the same motifs? Why do they have similar elements in their stories? I think it's because there was a great deluge. And I hope that I did a proper job explaining that and providing some historical evidence for that. And, of course, laying out why I think these other explanations don't actually work. If you guys think that I did, please do remember to share this video. Get this out to all your YEC friends. Remember to get this out to all the different social media platforms which you frequent. And of course, consider hitting the like button so that this is, you know, the YouTube algorithm sees this as being a good thing, right? If you did like this, please consider subscribing as well. Hit that bell to get notified every time that we go live. If you find this content to be good, if you find my apologetics to be worth it, please do consider subscribing on Patreon. You can give any amount that you like. I don't actually have any tiers or anything like that. Please only do so if you think that only do so if you feel led, if you think that I have earned it, if you think that I am a good apologist and I deserve to make this into a career. And also hit that bell to get notified every time we go live. I don't know if I actually said that. Remember to check out the original content. This was a video from a YouTuber named Atlas Pro. So we want to give credit where credit is due there. I'll go ahead and drop that in the live chat. And I need to just go ahead and edit my descriptions so this kind of stuff is in the description. Atlas Pro, if you ever do end up seeing this, please let me know what you think if you want to. You don't have to, but nonetheless, that would definitely be super sweet. My last response actually did have useful charts in the live chat, so that was pretty cool. That was like one of the cooler things that's happened to me, to be honest. But nonetheless, I appreciate all you guys being here. Please remember to pray for me because that is the number one thing you can do for me. Please remember to watch the majority of this video if you're not watching this live, because that is the number one thing you can do for the algorithm. And those of you who have already done so, thank you very much. I need to go ahead and get out of here and get some food because I am very hungry. But God bless you all. I hope you enjoyed church today. Do everything, of course, to the glory of God. And if the Lord wills and tarries, we will see you here soon.